retention is the foundation of growth. So both for the podcast listeners and for any customers that you have in your business, that's always the place we want to start, because growth is so much easier when you keep the existing ones.
Welcome to the Grow with Evelyn podcast. Today I have a really amazing guest for you, somebody I have the pleasure of working with in my business. Tom and his team from Fame have taken over the management of the Grow with Evelyn podcast since my old manager fired me. You have that conversation on the channel, and Tom has a really, really interesting journey to, now he is very successful with his agency, B2B agency, very, very professional. I'm so excited with how the experience has been up until this point. And he had a really interesting journey up until this point. For example, you were also on the British version of Shark Tank. Is that right, Tom?
That is great. It's called Dragon's Den over here.
So what did you present? What did you try to sell?
So we had an idea to sell leggings for men. This was back in 2014. And so it wasn't like a big thing. Now you see more men wearing leggings like for yoga or in the gym, right? It wasn't really a thing back then. And so, but we noticed that jeans were getting skinnier and skinnier. So we were like, the next natural thing is the male leggings. So we bought some leggings, tried to sell some on the market and failed, built an e-com store and actually started to sell some. Then we pitched them through the Dragons. The producer actually said to us before we pitched, like, this is a bit of a wild card. We're not sure how it's going to go. And we went on and basically just got destroyed. We can link to the highlights YouTube video below. But the worst thing one of them said, Duncan Bannatyne, he's like a grumpy old Scottish man. He said, you do realize that in 20 years, this is going to be on YouTube and your children are going to be watching this. And so 10 years later, it is on YouTube. But I don't have any kids yet, so.
Oh, that's hilarious. But you know what? I think that's so actually something to be proud of, because I think in reality, everyone in business is just failing forward. So I love to use moments like this to really connect with my audience. Yesterday, I shared, for example, that when I had those times where I was really down, I envisioned myself picking up a 2 Comma Club award in a dirndl, because I'm from Austria, it's the traditional clothing, with my son on my arm. And that just really kept me going in nights where I just couldn't find any sort of inspiration. What helped you to get going after the show? Like, how did you feel after? And how did you eventually go from selling leggings via e-commerce to now having this big podcasting agency?
Yeah, so after the show, basically it only goes on TV like a year later or something. And so nothing really happened after the show. You don't even know if you're going to be on TV. Then we got told we're going to be on TV, went on TV and actually sold loads of leggings. So it was actually more of a boost. It was like, wow, that's something that was just an idea. And then we sold loads of leggings, not like loads, but we sold an okay amount. Now, the journey from 2015 when I went on TV, I think, to today, I have probably tried about 15 different things and failed at all of them. And the only one that has been like, could be generally deemed a success, I think, is Fame, the podcast agency now. But like the theme, I guess, would be online marketing. It is probably the theme over that decade. And so because I knew that I couldn't be employed, but I also knew that I couldn't code and I was interested in the internet, the only thing I could really do was learn marketing. And so I really spent a decade learning online marketing, kind of pushed myself towards B2B and podcasts during that time. And that resulted in starting Fame.
This is so interesting to me. What got you towards podcasting in the first place? And, when you tell me I had 15 ventures and they all failed, having experienced how you work with clients and how the experience is, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I would love how you got there and how, you eventually were turning things around.
So we can wrap this up into one of those failed ventures. And I say failed because really I learned from all of them, but one of them was Upwork and Freelancer, the online marketplaces.
Yeah.
It was like that, but just for Filipino virtual assistants. It was called Virtual Valley. Okay. Started in like 2016, 17. And it was just me solo founding this like online marketplace.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, we actually did okay. Like took 6 months to launch. We had some VAs, people were hiring them. The revenue was going up, but probably underestimated that journey. And as a solo founder with no funding, ultimately didn't work. But on that journey, because I had 6 months while this development team were building the platform, my job was to build an audience of entrepreneurs so they would come to us when it launched. And so one of the things I did was launch I think it was a daily 10-minute podcast.
Okay.
I'd batch record it at the weekends, release 10-minute episode every day. And it would just be of what I'd done that day or what I was learning that week. And that we actually got sponsorship on that podcast and actually was maybe more successful than the platform when it launched. I remember this one guy who actually was like trying to invest in the business because of the podcast. And that for me was incredible because I'd obviously never met this man, never spoken to this man. And so that kind of highlighted to me the power of the podcast. And it also gave me the skill set. That was back in 2017. And then we'll skip forward to 2019 when I had a job for a year in a B2B SaaS company. And we, of course, started a podcast. It went really well. And then that led to fame.
Okay, cool. I love what you just said about you were just recording what you had experienced in that week. Alex Ramosi released a video on how, it was just a few days ago, I think it was how your mistakes can make you rich if you record them. And he also processed kind of his experience in a podcast. And I personally have always used kind of writing social media posts and emails to kind of process the things that I come across. Would you say that that's probably a good route to start for somebody who wants to get into podcasting to just document their journey through it? Or what would you say is kind of the easiest launch pad for a complete beginner?
Great question. I really like that method, like the solo podcast, but it probably isn't the best one because really to grow a big podcast, you need the feedback loop. You basically need people to like it. Otherwise, you're not going to stick in it for 5 years to make it grow. And to pull off a solo podcast, you do have to be like super knowledgeable, charismatic, and ideally like famous already. So I think it's a great experience. And I found myself being like improving in the way I spoke and the way I taught, but actually probably isn't what I recommend the beginner to do. What I would recommend the beginner to do is I would recommend like a single host, single guest setup to start with. It's like the easiest one to pull off. And the thing that I would also push for is to try to work out a way for the podcast to be great for you, even if you didn't have any listeners. So maybe that's building relationships with guests. Maybe that's some other way, or maybe that's you just being interested in the content itself. Because again, the only way it's going to work in the long term is if you stick with it and keep improving it every month. And you're not going to do that if you don't have this kind of external validation. So you need the internal benefit to keep going.
I would love to kind of recommend to everyone starting a podcast, also to beginners. However, in all, truthfully, when I look at my journey, I feel that I probably started it maybe a year too late, but I think there's probably like a sweet spot when you want to go and start a podcast. And I feel, and please correct me, I feel it is when you have a little bit of an email list where you can push the episodes to, so you can have that feedback. And that also makes it a little bit more interesting for guests when you have an audience they can, appear in front, and you have a little bit of experience that you can process in there. So you kind of know, kind of your niche almost naturally emerges when it's not like, oh, what could I make a podcast about? But if I was to make a podcast, it would definitely be something around this area. Would you agree with that, or am I off?
Yeah, you absolutely nailed it. I mean, you clearly have much better things to do, but you could literally come and be our advocate of fame. What I always say is that having a podcast is probably the slowest way to grow an audience, but it's the best way to like build a relationship with an existing audience. And the email list is the key. So in my opinion, and we're kind of broadening out a bit here, but I would like start with a social, build that with the organic social, build that up, send traffic down to the email list. Maybe that's a year. So year 1, so organic social, year 2, email list. Then year 3, because you're going to launch a podcast, immediately be able to get X amount of downloads because you just send it to the email list. And that, as you said, you've been building up relationships with potential guests for 1 to 2 years by that point anyway. So yeah, I totally agree with your setup.
Hey, Evelyn here. I just quickly wanted to hop on to encourage you to sign up to my newsletter. When you do that, you'll not only be informed as soon as a new episode drops, but you also get access to my exclusive growth goodie bag. That is a collection of highly valuable resources provided by our guests and myself, tools, strategies, case studies, templates, and so much more that will help you to grow and monetize that growth journey. If that sounds fair, then click the link and make sure to sign up to my newsletter.
I love that. So I have not shared this with you, but how I've grown my online audience is basically in reverse organic. So when you say social, I didn't have a lot of time for social. And I also knew there's a certain type of content I like to produce. And it wasn't, what was trending there, which was a lot of reels or the typical 5 tips. I always liked kind of the processing my emotions. But when you're nobody, there's a very small audience for, you processing your emotions. But basically what I did was I was using a strategic freebie, like some, PDF template, whatever, kind of filtering my audience, Facebook lead generation ads, and then you can grow your list. And on a thank you page, you can send people to your page, which is where they check out this kind of really intimate bottom of funnel content. And so I'm doing the same now for the podcast. I'm doing like a podcast goodie bag where maybe you want to contribute something for that. I'm always asking the guest. If the guest doesn't have something at hand, I'm going to contribute something from myself. But now basically I'm promoting the goodie box to get eyeballs on the podcast. And then under the podcast, I'm having opting in for the goodie box. So it's kind of this closing loop that I plan to grow it with, because I feel the mistake people also make with content is that they forget about the distribution, right? So not for everyone, the content in itself will be the distribution vehicle, especially if you're just starting out and your content kind of sucks a little bit, right?
You're totally right. And I'd love to dig into this, by the way. So I think you're excellent at this whole content setup. So what you're saying is that you didn't start out with organic social. You started out running paid spend to build the email list, right? Yeah. I do think if you have really good online marketing skills, that's a great way to go, because you're probably going to cut down the time you spend money to get the time, right? And then just quickly on the podcast goodie bag thing or goodie box, I understand that this is something we're driving the podcast listeners to, but then you're also saying that you're going to run paid spend to the goodie box to expose people to the podcast. Oh, here we go. This is awesome. This is innovative stuff, Evelyn, by the way, paid to an opt-in to then drive to the podcast. I absolutely love it. So, and yeah, I'm definitely up for submitting something to the goodie box to help with that conversion, hopefully.
That would be good. What would you contribute for kind of the person that is, I think one good thing is when you are at this point where you have built a little bit of audience, you are, at somewhat consistency in your business is either you're almost full-time or you're just full-time, and now you're thinking about, now you have the perspective to think about a long-term vehicle, which for me the podcast really is, because I know I will invest into it before I have it's just something that needs a longer perspective, longer stamina. And so for somebody who is at that point in their business where they can afford to have that, what would be the one thing that you would want to give them at this point if they're considering a podcast?
Yeah. Okay. So they don't have one yet.
No, they're on the fence, kind of deciding. There's so many options that you have at this point. It could be also that you go into just really the YouTube game, but not with podcasts, with the 10-minute videos, right? Or with shorts, or you're a guest podcaster, or you do the PR, so there's a lot of options that you then have that are a little bit of a longer game. For me, ultimately, podcasting felt right, but it wasn't easy to make that decision.
Yeah, so the thing I'll provide is probably one of two things. And it's going to be the thing that, if they choose the podcast route, this is going to be the two most important things, I think, if they start, because anything above that, maybe I'm a bit outside of my pay grade, So we believe at Fame, and I strongly believe for business and for podcasting, that retention is the foundation of growth. And so there's two core things we need in order to build a podcast that is going to keep the listeners. Because if you keep the listeners, it's very easy to grow. So the first thing is I recorded a podcast series on how to be an awesome interviewer. And so that's going to be key, I think, for anyone starting a podcast to retain listeners. It's the second most important thing for a good episode is the skill of the host after the guest. So hopefully I'm doing a good job here. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that we have a positioning process. So if we nail the positioning of the show, then everything else after that becomes easier. I'll just quickly explain that because it could be useful for people listening. There's really two parts to it. So the first is we call the niche of the show, e.g. the category, And the second part is called the edge. And so a quick example, and also a little plug here, is Confessions of a B2B Entrepreneur is my show. And so very clear, the niche of that show is B2B entrepreneurship. And then the edge is that confessions piece where we're trying to get guests to share something maybe they haven't shared. And you are coming on the show, by the way. So we're going to get you to confess some things as well. So that's the positioning process, but there's like a doc that walks you through that. And so I think that could be useful because if you get that right, everything else is easier after that.
I can totally see that. And I would love to watch the episode on being a good interviewer because I think I have a skill gap, right? I'm working actively on it. One thing that the agency provides that I really love is the host coaching. So I get this feedback, how I did as the interviewer. And I think this is so tremendously valuable because I can see from the feedback how there's a huge skill curve to becoming a good interviewer as well. I think I chose podcasting for me because I feel that I love to go deep into things, right? When I teach and how I build things, I
can tell from the content I've seen.
So it's I don't do like superficial, and I don't like to sugarcoat things. So that's also why I loved the name of your podcast. I was like, oh, that's good, and I really love that kind of transparency element. So that very much resonates with me, and I feel like podcasting allows you to do that when other formats don't do that. And when I think now, running ads to the goodie box and having the first touch point with my brand, the podcast, I feel that's a huge opportunity to allow people to perceive me a little bit more holistically than, for example, one of my biggest or most successful projects was the Coach Growth Hub. At the same time, now I'm the coach girl, and I always felt like really cornered by that positioning that naturally emerged by that very successful kind of product and membership. And I feel like a podcast allows you to show up more holistically also as the host, because who you pick as the guest, how you interact with them, the questions you ask, they also allow people to read between the lines a lot around who you are. How would you recommend a podcast host who is a business owner uses the podcast to position themselves? Because it's different to position the podcast and then to position yourself as the business owner. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so we really have three things. We have the positioning of the company, the positioning of the founder, and then the positioning of the podcast, which actually can also be separate. And so what we often like to do, so in the positioning part of the process, we're talking about the niche here, which is like, what is the bucket we put this podcast into? And so ideally, we would have the founder, not always, but the founder of the business is the host of the show, so that we can use the process to build up the profile of the founder, which will just help the business. And then on the positioning of the show, we often like to find a category that the business sits within that is what we would say uncomfortably narrow. And so what that would allow us to be is, in a relatively short amount of time, the number one podcast in X category. And so maybe just to give an example, if there was an email marketing agency and we'd take the founder of the agency, they would be the host of the show. And then we probably wouldn't have the positioning of the show as email marketing. We would probably go, or would suggest to go slightly more niche, maybe just focused on open rates. So the podcast would be like the open rate podcast. The founder would be the host. And so then probably in 6 months, we could be the number one open rate podcast. And then our host and founder would be the open rate guy. But then the great thing about that is once we have that loyal audience, it's much easier to broaden out.
Yeah.
And so we probably go narrow and then go broader.
Yeah, it's almost like an hourglass with the positioning, right? So you start like relatively broad, then you double down on one thing, and that allows you to attract so many people that you can go broad again. I love that.
Exactly.
It's so genius for service-based businesses as well, right? Because you would look for a specialist. Do you have some like favorite case studies, some where you're like, that was so weird, but it was so genius for how we positioned them or how it played out for their business?
Yeah, let me have a think. So there's a big consulting company, probably like 500 people, and they did tech consulting in like 4 different areas. One of those areas was sustainability. And he wasn't the founder of the company, he was one of the VPs. He was he wanted to do a podcast, and he was seeing that this area, sustainability, is like the future. And so the show was just focused around that area. It was called Hardware to Save, or is called Hardware to Save a Planet, kind of taking out, there's another podcast called something, Hardware to Save the World or something. Or anyway. And so we basically lifted that positioning, just focused on this niche. He was the host, brought on customers that were, I think, entrepreneurs or tech people at sustainability startups, build those relationships. I believe they have got some work from relationships with guests, but then at the same time has built this VP's profile in the world of sustainability tech consulting. And he now gets invited to go and like do live podcasts on the stage at these sustainability events. So that's an example where the positioning of the show was much more narrow than the positioning of the business, but still worked out quite well.
That's such a cool example. And I think that this is something I also slept on for such a long time, right? So we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, and we're like, that's the whole online marketing world, basically. And then you look kind of in the direction of podcasting, you're like, there are many more audiences and ecosystems that I haven't even considered, because I was just thinking about what, the most common ones. And so that was really for me with podcasting. And one thing that also didn't click for me at all was the relationship with the guest. Duh. So I would love to speak a little bit about that. And then I would love to speak about LinkedIn, because you got me on that one too.
Yeah, so guest relationships. Obviously, you can't like pitch guests, but I have a belief about relationships in humans is that the deep relationships are formed based on like how much the emotional roller coaster you go through with someone. So someone who you're really close with, your best friend, you went traveling, you went through all through this emotional roller coaster. And so what you have with every guest, you are going through this, obviously not the same as like traveling or doing something significant in life, but you are going through a mini roller coaster. So therefore what you have with every guest is the chance to build some kind of relationship. And so we just want to be strategic about those relationships that we build, because obviously we can't like pitch people, but if you build this relationship with people that you can help and can help you at some point in the future, then the podcast is just going to be more viable. And so there's really two ways that we suggest to go about it. Is first, actually three. So first is, could someone be a good customer for your business? Now, again, you're not going to pitch them, but you're going to bring them into your network. You're going to add value to them by promoting them. Second is, could they be a partner, e.g., do they have an audience of people that could be your customers? Again, you're going to add value to them after the interview, and maybe they'll become a partner. And third is, do they have an audience of people that could be listeners to the podcast? Because if you do an amazing job, they come on and they really like the content you create for them, they're going to share it, and that's going to help you grow the show. And so those are three things we do look for in an ideal guest, but they are all kind of secondary. If we're trying to build a good podcast, they are secondary to the number one goal, which is, do they know about stuff that could help our listeners?
I love all of that. This is beautiful. And I also feel like the partnering up is a really amazing opportunity that kind of emerges from that. I had the podcast with Laura Porty was published just last week. And it was actually beautiful, because after the episode, she suggested to take a look at my ad account and maybe we can co-create something for our community.
Really?
Yeah. So
amazing.
Absolutely beautiful. And I think because we actually have quite a bit of overlap in our memberships, and it would be beautiful for both our communities to do something for them. So I totally can have experience with those few podcasts I created so far, how that very naturally and without, I think none of us thought about it before the podcast, but it kind of emerged through the conversation. So
for sure. And this just goes back to the thing that the key thing for success. We have the positioning part we discussed, but then really the consistency part. And so if we can work out a way to gain a benefit from the show that isn't directly from getting loads of listeners, then we're more likely to be able to be consistently good with the show, which is going to lead to that end goal.
I mean, I think also when I talk to you about when to start a podcast, I don't think I would have been able to start a podcast before I would have been able to bring on somebody to help me, just because it's such a huge learning curve. And I really have to say the way it's working right now is you guys help me to look for the guests. I get a one-pager fact sheet as well. So I can prepare really, really quickly for the interview. And then I sit down in a studio that is prepared for me. I record, and then the rest kind of happens naturally. So for the person listening that might not or might work up to this point, can you explain what is all the magic that you do for me in the background?
So we break down the service, and so I'll talk as if someone is going to do it themselves. So you can break down your podcast into 3 areas. So there's finding and booking the guests, producing the assets, and promoting the show. So talk about finding and booking the guests. Here, we've actually covered this. So there's 3 like secondary benefits and 1 main one is, or criteria. Main one is, can they add value to the audience? And then the 3 are, could they be customers, partners, or do they have an audience of potential listeners? So you basically just want to build a list of those people. Now, ideally, as you said, you've maybe already been posting on social, or you have the email list, and so you might already know these people. So just put a list in a Google Sheet and reach out one by one. Ideally, you know them already. It's going to be very easy. Or maybe you know people that know them. That makes it easier. If you don't and you're going in cold, then the key is social proof. And I'm sure maybe you get podcast requests when I do. The first thing I'm looking at is, who else do I know has been on this? And so in that first message, we want to explain the positioning of the show, and we want to put in names of other guests that have been on. And so you're really, the key, I think, to growing a show is climbing the ladder of guest authority in your specific niche. And it takes time. I've done 140 episodes, and only really in the past 3 months have I got names that I'm like, wow, I can't believe I'm speaking to these people. So it takes time because you're just adding to your social proof with every good guest you get. And for the site, maybe 1 in 10 is a big name, but then, so that's guest stuff. Enough detail there, enough actionable tips. Cool.
I would love to kind of ask one more.
Yeah.
So, because I think this is really interesting when you talked, maybe I would just want to dwell maybe a little bit on it, because I think it's so important. And it was such a aha moment when you guys talked about that it's basically almost like a domino effect, right? So it's like you can go slightly bigger and it kind of up levels, and with every guest you can you talk to me a little bit about this? Because my mind was really blown when you put that into context for me. I had never connected the dots.
Yeah, for sure. The biggest shows have the best guests, but the best guests don't go on little shows. They only go on shows where either they know somebody has been on, or they know you. And so what we basically have to do is go through cold outreach. Well, first you start with a network. And if you've been doing year 1 and year 2 well, you're going to know these people already because you've been replying to their tweets and commenting on LinkedIn, etc. And so maybe you can bag a couple of big ones straight away. And that is awesome, because then you just take their names. And then for the other, like, let's say medium-sized guests you go for next, you're going to be able to get them because you've already had the big names on. Now, what you're also doing at the same time is every guest that comes on, you're asking them if they know anybody that they think could be a good fit on the show. Because again, if they're big names and they had a good experience, they like the content you create, then you're going to get those guest referrals, and that's going to help because those people are warm and ideally big names. And then you're just literally repeating this cycle until you end up getting the biggest names that there are. There's a podcast we have in the UK called Diary of the CEO. And it actually started out, it's by a guy called Stephen Butler. He actually started out as a solo show, like a diary one. But then he has just been climbing the ladder. And now he gets like the absolute biggest names, biggest authors, etc. on the show. But he's like probably on episode 400 now. And so he's just executed this. So it's not like voodoo magic. It's just climbing the ladder of social proof.
Mm-hmm. You know, I love that, because although why it might seem like, oh, this is going to take me a long time, it's like, but it's also a very clear path. I just have to keep showing up. So
the other thing that's happening is you're climbing the ladder of social proof is you're getting better at doing the interviews. What that means is that every guest is going to have a slightly better experience, because they enjoy the conversation more. And then also you're going to be creating better content. And so the content that comes out of it, the guest is going to like more. More people are going to go to the guest and say, hey, I heard you on Grow with Evelyn, etc. And so you should all be like, the flywheel should get easier and easier to turn as you have more practice.
That's beautiful. So that's guest management. What else do we have to do?
Editing and production. And I'm also going to talk about ops here, because if you don't get the ops right, then you are going to be drowning in admin. So let's do ops quickly. Well, what you essentially want to do, or the key process once we've booked the guests, should ideally be automated. And what that means is that we have Zapier or any other tool that's good for automation connected to the guest booking software. And then when the guest books, that is going to produce all the different tasks that need to be done, assigned to the different people with the right due dates and the right labels in your project management software. So that's like one key thing that if you get that right, it makes everything else so much easier. So that's one key automation that I'd recommend. in terms of the people, like you can do it all yourself. You could do the editing, the video editing, finding the guests, doing the project management, doing the hosting. If you wanted to make one hire, the hire I would probably make would be the audio and video editor. So then you can just get the audio, long form video and snippets done. And then you have to do, that'll probably cut out 30% of the work. That's probably the first thing to outsource.
And where would you find like a good one, and what would you look for? Just if you can give me 3 hints.
Yeah. So when we need freelance talent, we typically use Upwork, but there are other freelancer marketplaces. And what are we looking for? What I would say is just ensure that the editor has some idea or interest in the topic of the show. Can help massively. And then they also share examples of work they've done previously. And if they're able to show that they have passion or interest and show examples that are related to your show and you like the quality of the work, then we do a test. So maybe just create 1 or 2 videos or 1 audio and you pay them for that. And then maybe you run that test with 2-3 people and then you choose the best one and then you bring them into your system. Second thing to outsource would potentially be the written. So typically for every episode, you need some visual design done as well. So it'd either be the visual designer, again, you can run through the same process we just described, or someone to do the writing. So here's what's the title of the show, which snippet should we select, and what is the episode description and the blog post that we can create from it. Those are the next 2 things that I'll probably outsource. Or we have a role called the project manager, which is the person who's really responsible for everything happening on time. And so that's probably the next thing after that, is that then the project manager manages those 3 people. And then you just work with the project manager. They can do the guest outreach. They can do most of the promotion tasks as well. So that's like high level how ops could work for the show. But again, like you could perfectly fine to do it all yourself, but it might just take up a big chunk of time.
Oh, and it's also like a huge learning curve, right? So that's the portion. I just wanted to quickly ask something. I get those sheets with the cool summaries of the show. Is that a podcast? Should I be putting that on a website?
The interview sheet of the also not about the guest, about the episode.
Yeah. So should I be putting that somewhere? Please let me know.
Oh well, yeah, we will. We'll do that for you. But here's one of the beautiful things about the podcast, right? Is that you have this one core central video and audio asset. And then you create the mini videos, you create the social posts, but then you also have a long form piece of written content that is good for SEO. And so, yeah, we would suggest that for every episode, the written assets with key takeaways, links to the guest, will be one blog post with the embedded video and embedded audio on a domain that we're trying to build. What I love about the podcast is it's a content marketing play, but you get the partnership benefits, you get the direct sales benefits from the guests. You get the SEO upside, you get the organic content for social as well. And so, yes, we would recommend that.
So thank you so much. We covered guest ops. Now distribution, probably?
Yeah, so on promotion, the first thing I'll say is that retention is foundation of growth. So what we always want to look at first is can we tweak or improve the production? And can we tweak or improve our host skills? And can we get better guests? So if we do that right, then promotion is so much easier if you retain the listeners you have. But let's talk, maybe I'll just pick out some things that I am seeing right now. Maybe I'm biased because LinkedIn's working really well at the moment. If we have our host on LinkedIn posting regularly and we pick out a concept from an episode that is, or for each episode, if we pick out a concept, post organically from the host's profile, not even really mentioning the podcast, we can link in the comments, and we put in a video, maybe an image, and we're just doing that once per week. If we're posting other stuff like top of the funnel content on that host LinkedIn profile, then these podcast posts are going to get a bit more attention every week. And then when one pops off, e.g. it gets a little bit more engagement than normal, then what we like to do is boost that post with LinkedIn thought leader ads, which basically means that we can promote the personal post through a page, ideally the page of the podcast that we've created. And then we maybe just put $50, $100 on that. And then we keep doing that to the ones that pop off. That's a really good way to get cheap impressions because the algorithm already likes the content. And so you're going to get cheap impressions to boost every episode. So that's one thing. It is paid, but then also is combined with the organic, what we call organic social from the show. So that's one thing that I'm using at the moment. One thing that has been working for a while now is there are a lot of underutilized SEO real estate. Essentially, if you search for top X podcasts in any niche, there'll most probably be a load of articles sharing the top X podcasts of each niche. So we had a client in the IoT space. And so if you were to search top IoT podcasts, you see a load of articles. And what we essentially did is just like, we wrote our own. We have a domain that's quite strong, so we could rank for that. Then we also go to all of them and do some kind of deal to get featured. So the best one was we actually ended up bringing the CEO of the number one ranking business on as a guest star show because we knew he would be a good CEO because he had the authority, and they put us at the top of the list. So basically, it cost us nothing. We got a guest and we got featured on the list. And then we went down the others. Some you have to pay. Sometimes you can do a link exchange, and some they'll just put you on for free. And so then you have this kind of consistent, it might not be high volume, but consistent new people finding the show. So second stuff like an SEO play. First one was paid organic. Something a little bit sneaky, again, this is SEO, but in the podcast directories themselves. This is just being sneaky with the keywords. So you have the author field, you have the description field, and you have the name of the show. So it's actually that same podcast. It had like a very nicely branded name before we started working with them. It's called Over the Air, some IoT term. And all we did was just change the name of the podcast to IoT podcast - Over the Air. And we also put IoT in the author field. So like the IoT podcast network's a bit misleading. Just having that, like our rankings for the term IoT went from like 10s, 20s, 30s to like top 5 straight away. And so again, that is a very cheap way to get a slow, probably low volume, because not that many people are searching for IoT and Apple Podcasts, but like a slow, consistent flow of new listeners. So there's 3 tactics. Happy to dig deeper for more if we think it could be useful.
I think it would be super interesting. And I also love to dig in because I think that it's such a good mindset to get hacky with growth, like to look for those ways that not many people are considering. And also when you say, it just trickles away, but those people that look for this specific podcast, I mean, it couldn't be more of an ideal client probably. So I would love if you could expand on that. And also, I'm not fully understanding. So this is how you know how little I know about this. For me, it's really, really great to have the podcast to tap into other audiences than Facebook and Instagram, where I can run those kind of ads. So that's really cool to tap into the SEO. But for example, the podcast directory is like, what is that? How does that work? And are people listening to podcasts in general people you can't necessarily reach somewhere else? Or do you notice some differences in the audiences, in the type of people that listen to podcasts?
The thing I would love to say is that typically people that listen to podcasts, I don't want to be negative at all. I like the more like thoughtful people, or like there's been surveys that show that people that listen to podcasts, not watch on YouTube, and the people that are like slightly higher than average earners are like more thoughtful people that care about learning. And so I don't want to be negative about any other. I don't want to be negative about people that don't want to listen to podcasts. But let's talk about directories. So Apple and Spotify are the key two, and YouTube is actually coming in to be the third, right? But for Apple and Spotify, what we know is that rankings in Apple Podcasts specifically is based on the number of new followers in a short time window. And so if you spike followers in a short period of time, you'll go up and you'll get into the rankings. Then obviously if you're continually getting a load of new followers, e.g. because you're doing these strategies, then you'll spike higher and you'll be consistently there. And then that's just a self-fulfilling prophecy because then you're getting new followers from the rankings. So Apple also, when a show launches, we believe, or we've seen, like prioritizes that slightly. So if you launch a show and then you do the launch process and you get a load of new followers in a short period of time, you should spike up in the rankings. And what's great about that is that you then, let's say you're an entrepreneurship podcast, you get into the top 10 in the US, which isn't that unobtainable. You maybe need 100 new followers. So if you have an email list, you should be able to get there in that short time window. Then what you can basically say, you can add this as social proof for your guest outreach. You can say we're a top 10 entrepreneur podcast in the US because it's true, and you can have the screenshot of showing you there. So left directories, we want to optimize SEO, and we want to, especially when we're launching, maximize new followers in a short time window to spike up the rankings. Other promotion strategies. Here's one that I haven't nailed yet, but I've seen a client do it. And essentially what it is quite cheeky as well, is in your specific niche, go and get the email addresses of all the ideal customers. And the more specific and the more B2B, the better, because you can just go to Apollo and get the 1,000 email addresses of all those people. And then you can literally just cold email them, explaining that you have the show. And then with every episode, and so maybe we'll get a few followers there. Then with every episode, if you write the emails correctly, you can just be cold emailing this list and building up the followers that way, which is quite an interesting way. And it's really working for their show. I haven't reproduced that for myself yet, but I'm for my to-do list. So I think that's an interesting way, a little bit cheeky because it's cold email, but I think that works better if you have a show that's like, the show you're creating is going to be absolutely ideal for that very specific type of B2B persona. Probably wouldn't work so much in B2C. So that's another one. We are seeing like in person, like going in person to getting podcast subscribers. And so if any of our clients ever an event and they produce banners to be an event, we always want to have a QR code to Apple Podcasts and to Spotify on that banner or somewhere on their stand. And then little like business cards with a QR code to Apple Podcasts and Spotify, because that's a super easy way to pick up qualified followers. Should we do more?
I think that those are all like really, really great. My mind is just like racing with opportunities because I think I didn't do like an official launch until now. I've been mentioning and saying there's a new episode, but I've not had like a giveaway or something because I mean there are things I can do to get 100 followers like tomorrow. So that's why my mind is just like racing out and okay, what could we do there? Maybe have like an Easter egg in one episode and, have people submitting. And that could be a cool thing to do.
When you have the existing audience of people that know, like, and trust you, the podcast game gets quite easy. And so this is what I say, it's like probably the worst thing to build the audience, but it's the best thing to build a relationship with the audience, which is exactly why it's like perfect for you at this stage, because you spent a load of time and money building this like community of people that like really like love you and look up to you. And then this gives them the way to like really get to know Evelyn.
Mm-hmm. I totally see that. Maybe it's a good opportunity. I'm always thinking about the person that is just starting out that, might need to be really, really mindful with where do I allocate my resources. Might be trying to become a viable guest for podcasts be a good way to still leverage them? And if so, how would I, for example, let's say I'm starting from scratch, I don't have like a lot of audience yet. How would I turn myself into an attractive podcast guest?
Somewhat similar to the guest outreach process. What we're really doing is trying to make the offer as good as possible. So what I didn't mention in the guest outreach process is what we typically also do is be like, we just need like these 3 massive names that you've never been on the show. We just need 45 minutes of your time. We currently have 10,000 downloads a month. So the offer is pretty good. So we just do the exact same thing, but for the guest approaching the show. So the first thing is we want to make sure we align the expertise and the passion of the guest with the shows that we try to go on. So when we're building that list, only put shows that you can really add value to the audience. And then we have to think about, what does the podcast host really want? They obviously want guests that are going to be good for the audience, but the second thing they want after that is more exposure. And so we're actually just prepping this for you today. We want to essentially tell them that if you bring me on the show, I'm going to do X, Y, Z for you. And so those things are typically, we're going to put a page on our site about the episode for you and give you a backlink. We are going to post organically about the episode on these 3 social channels with this many followers and send it to our email list. And then the final one is we're also going to spend $50 of Facebook ads to promote the episode. And so that, if we get the targeting right, so the host is like, yeah, this person knows and that's relevant to audience. And then you get these 3 like promotion pieces right, then that should boost the conversion. And to answer your question, I do think it is a good way for somebody that's starting out. It's a much lower lift way of doing it. And you'll also get the taste for, do you enjoy like talking with somebody and creating video and audio content before potentially doing it yourself?
Thank you so much for walking me through. Again, like a few aha moments. It's like having that personalized pitch, right? Because you know that podcast and you have tuned in and you know kind of maybe a gap you can fill or something where you can contribute an opinion. So that was an aha moment. Also, what we can offer to make it more attractive to come, because there's also so many things that can be done. And even, many people are just wanting snippets, right? Even if somebody would just say, if somebody would tell me right now, I'm coming on your show and I'm clipping all my snippets for you and you can have them for redistribution, I would be like, that's awesome because I'm looking for those. So many ways in which you can create value. I think that's interesting. And I think also for somebody who has achieved a certain level of success in a certain area, a podcast might be one of the quickest ways to create social proof for themselves, because the host might really just be looking for an interesting story to tell. And that will be also a very presentable piece of content you can share with others when you introduce yourself, when you want to open doors. So
yeah, for sure. Especially if you manage to get on with one of the bigger ones that other people in your niche know. Yeah, I've been on this podcast, that can open doors for sure.
So I think that's a good, probably. So when you're starting out, thinking about how you can be featured on podcasts, where would somebody find lists of podcasts that they can pitch to or make themselves familiar with? Just manually looking through, or are there other ways where you can maybe buy a list or something?
Yeah, I would probably just go to the podcast app that you listen to and search for the keywords, and then take out the links, add them to a spreadsheet, and then start the outreach from there. I don't think it needs to be, I don't think you would need to buy a list. Like they're all pretty discoverable on the apps or just on Google.
Can you tell me about the keywords?
So let's say I was trying to get on podcasts. I would right now focus on entrepreneur shows. So I use Spotify to listen to podcasts. So I'd probably just search for entrepreneur, probably search for B2B entrepreneur, and probably search for entrepreneurship. And that will probably give me 50 maybe. Now there is one quite a cool hack, and I don't have you know, in Google you can do advanced search. You can basically search for, we need the word podcast in there, we need your niche, so entrepreneurship, and then you can also search for the word guest or guest form. And what this should return, if you get that right, is all the podcasts in that niche that have a page on their site for filling out guest forms to bring guests on.
Oh,
that's quite a cool one. What I'll do is I'll get the exact search string and we can put it in the show notes of this episode.
Awesome. Yeah, yes, please. That's a really, really cool hack. So many good things here. I would love to still, there's so many tactics that we learned today. I would love to take kind of a step back and talk about what podcasting did beyond, now it is your core business that is very successful. You've grown your own podcast. You have helped so many other people to do that. What was the secondary benefit beyond, making this your full-time passion business?
Yeah, I think maybe a secondary drawback is that because I also listen to a lot of podcasts every day. And so whenever the intro is a bit off or the host messes up, I'm like, oh, God, they need to do that better. So that's a drawback, but it's only a very minor one. Probably the second bit of benefit, I think it's probably the people I've met through them being a guest on my show or me being a guest on their show. Because I've met some people, one guy became a mentor. Some people have become partners or customers. Some people just become people, internet friends, those friends that you don't really see in real life because they live in a different place. So that's probably been the biggest gift. And it's kind of, if you think about it, if you do 140 episodes, and maybe I've been a guest on 10 or 20 podcasts, that's 150 people that are in your area because that's what you're talking. And it's someone that you've had a deeper conversation with. Obviously, you're going to end up building good relationships. So I think that is a secondary benefit, but it's definitely a very real one that should occur.
Yeah. It's actually incredible if you think about it, and just the association with all of those brands, right? And it's not somebody interviews you for the podcast and then they don't work on their brand anymore. It's you guys meet at a point in time and then everybody goes off working and reinvesting into their brand, and that association lives on forever. The episode lives on forever, and it becomes more and more valuable over time. I think that's what I like so much about it, is this almost appreciating asset.
Yeah, exactly. Every episode should be there in If you're like compounding the organic views, the content you get.
Maybe one last question for the beginning, for the person that is at the very beginning. What are the top 3 lessons from podcasting that you would give your own entrepreneurial self that just started out on the very first venture?
Yeah, and these are kind of maybe a little rehash what we covered, but there's probably 3 things we have to get right. First, we have to get the positioning right. And the reason I say that is because if you get that right, finding guests, promoting the show, you being interested in hosting is going to be so much easier. So that's the niche, which is the category, and the edge, which is the thing that a listener would tell their friends about. So positioning, we want to nail that first. Second, be strategic about guests, because again, if we can get some kind of benefit that isn't related to you getting loads of listeners, you're going to keep doing it. You're going to be consistent. And that leads nicely onto the third one, which is just to pick a frequency that you're confident that you can release that for a period of years. And so maybe don't start weekly if you're not confident you can do that for 3 years. Maybe start bi-weekly. You can always go to weekly later. So nail the positioning, be strategic about guests, and then be consistent for years.
That's beautiful. The way I intended to ask the question was, lessons kind of beyond the podcasting. But I think if we take your answer and we can pull this over a business in general, which is, your positioning, being really mindful about relationships, and then keep showing up. I think that applies to the podcasting as well as to no matter where you are in business, right? So even at the starting point.
What you did there was very nice, and I totally agree that all of them can apply to a business as well. The final thing I would want to add to that applies to both for sure is retention is the foundation of growth. So both for the podcast listeners and for any customers that you have in your business, that's always the place we want to start, because growth is so much easier when you keep the existing ones.
Also, really, really good point. Now for the person that is further in their journey, that maybe a couple things where you're like, this is where most are leaving so much money opportunity on the table because they don't consider this.
I think let's do 3 things. So we'll do consistent host coaching. And if you're on your own, you're not working with anyone, how would I do this? Maybe I'd just send episodes to friends and be like, hey, what do you think? Like, what could I do better here? We also like to track filler words. And so just try and be aware of the filler words you're using and try to eradicate or reduce them. So that's the first thing. Second thing, I think for intermediate is like, and are we talking about podcast here or business in general, or both podcast? Social proof and guest outreach, I think, for intermediate, because by that time you should ideally have some kind of big names. Make sure you're using them in your outreach and asking them for referrals. And then I would say, try to just build a big organic audience on one social channel. It's kind of separate to the podcast. But once you have that, then building the email list and building the podcast is so much easier. So just most people I see like try to do Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. I would just scrap them all, choose one, the content medium is the one that you're best at, and just only do that for a year, because that really can unlock a lot of growth for everything else.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time. That was really, really insightful. Anything else that you would want to give the person listening to conclude?
Well, so we're going to add some stuff into the podcast, into the box, into the bundle. But no, I think that's it. Retention and foundation growth, I think, is if I could only give myself one piece of advice like 5 or 10 years ago, it would probably be that. Like, that is the key, I feel, in business and marketing, to make everything so much easier. It's like the less sexy thing, like improving the product or improving your host, using less filler words in your podcast. But if those small 1% changes compound and can really lead to great growth.
Thanks so much.